So, Ray, you know the heavy level of preparation that we do for the Ray Dregs Hockey Podcast. So I reached out to our next guest, Scott Rintoul, earlier today, just to say, hey, Scott, we crossed paths years ago, worked television, you're a veteran, all of these things. How do you want me to introduce you? And, what are some of the finer points that you want to drill down on? How do you think Scott Rintoul said, here's how you should introduce me? What comes to mind when you think of Scott Rintoul?
Morning show co-host of Ray Ferraro. Was that it?
Close. No, that wasn't it.
That wasn't it.
No. Okay, you ready? Okay, here it is. Veteran broadcaster turned podcaster. And then he goes on, creator of UNREEL, WestCoast Express, which is all true, but it's very dignified. True,
but it's legit. You asked for, if you know Scotty, Scotty, is this fair? You're a detail guy.
I am a detail guy, and I also thought that sounded a lot better than, like you, Dregs, piggybacked Ray around on a show.
Hey, last week, Scotty, you said you listened to last week, and, we were complaining about booking guests. I said, no, that was just Dregs. I said, I've booked one guest this year. Two, actually.
Two now, yeah.
And one of them is you, and one of them did not have any links to this. I don't think there's a correlation. It's got nothing to do with me.
Okay.
Nothing to do with you at all. Nothing at all. You are better talking about opossums and raccoons and your dogs with Dregs, and maybe who's going to win in a fight between you two. I thought that's why you guys were bringing me on, to ultimately be the judge on that.
No, we gave up on that.
That would be that would be the easiest work you've ever had, right there.
In fairness, Ray, that's why we have Rob, Gray, and Raheem. We've got this great cast.
What the hell were they doing?
Producers. I know, when you work a game for ESPN or ABC, they don't ask you to go and plug the truck in, right? You show up and you do what you need to do.
We know why that doesn't happen, right? We'd never get on the air.
Fair enough. All right,
Scotty, how are you doing?
Yeah, he looks like he's doing great.
I'm great, guys. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure, as always, to hook up with you two.
Okay,
Scotty,
let's dive into it.
Oh, sorry, you go ahead, Dregs. You go ahead.
Yeah, look, I'll introduce the podcast, and then Ray, you can dive in with some of the details after that. But Scott, the podcast that you worked on, which I wasn't making fun of in any way, shape, or form as part of your introduction, right? WestCoast Express. About one of the NHL's great lines and all the trials and tribulations of that great line. What's unique and impressive is not just the level of detail, which we've already kind of made fun of, but the fact that to do it in a long form the way that you have allows you to present everything, all of the details, because there's so much that went into that era of the Vancouver Canucks. But why this story, and how fantastic is it to be able to do the deep dive that you've done?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. It has been a thrill, and it's been a lot of detail, but it has been fun. This is something I've never done before. And you guys know, based on the mediums we've worked in, you don't get to sink your teeth into a lot of things for as long as you'd like to. You almost leave every long interview or every broadcast thinking, I wish we could have just done a little more with that particular person or heard a couple more stories. But this allows you to do that. And why this story? Pretty simple. On the surface, it's just three guys acquired by three different general managers who didn't really work out with their original teams, and somehow they end up being the most dominant line in the NHL for a short period of time, but still the most dominant line in the NHL. That on the surface is a great story. But when you mentioned earlier the trials and tribulations, they had so many memorable moments together, some of them triumphant, some of them on the other side, where it was unforgettable heartache. But it seemed like every single year there was something happen that as a hockey fan, you just wouldn't forget. And it made for a compelling story to tell.
When the Canucks were in that time frame, they get to the Cup final in '94. They lose to the Rangers in just an unbelievable series. It was an unreal series. And then things kind of tailed away. You've lived in Vancouver pretty much your whole life. At that time, the Canucks were just looking for something, anything. And then it all hit. What was as you talk to people, what was the first part of that thing that had to work? The acquisition of Brendan Morrison, Markus Naslund, and Todd Bertuzzi? Like, what was the first thing that had to hit?
It seems like the first thing that really had to hit, Ray, with all due respect to those players, was probably Brian Burke. And the reason I say that is because that time was so chaotic in Canucks history. You mentioned they go to the Cup final, one of the most memorable ones ever. And 4 years later, nobody knows which way is up. Like, quite literally, Corey Hirsch says in the podcast, he didn't know at one point who the GM was. Like, he wasn't sure who the general manager was. Was it Mike Keenan? Was it Steve Tambellini? Nobody really knew. And that's where they were in only 4 short years. So Brian Burke came in and gave them stability. Now, Naslund was already here in Vancouver. Bertuzzi had recently been acquired by Mike Keenan when Burke arrived. But they weren't what they were going to be. Burke gave the foundation, and he said, all right, I'm going to be here. And you knew Burke and Keenan weren't going to coexist for very long based on the way that both of them are. But
and that's not even, Scotty, and that's not even revisionist history.
No.
As soon as Berkey came in, it seemed like pick a date because it's going to happen, correct?
Yeah, no question about it. And people detail that in the podcast. And Burke said, I promised ownership that I would make sure we gave Mike Keenan a chance. But you guys both know Berkey. I don't know how long that leash was ever going to be.
No.
You know, Scotty, a few years ago, you sent me a note about listening to this long-form podcast. And I'm generally a one-episode type of podcast listener. But you got me into the podcast about the NBA official scandal. And the way you said it is, you probably think you know a lot about the story, but man, this is fascinating. And what I found was like 100 things, honestly, that I had no idea about. What are some of the most remarkable things you found out about the West Coast Express that, even though you lived it and lived around it and were in the media, you didn't know?
Man, there's a laundry list, quite frankly. One of the big ones that jumps out, though, Ray, is how bad the relationship got between Mark Crawford and Todd Bertuzzi. And I think most people know what Todd Bertuzzi's persona was back in the day. That doesn't mean that's how he was as a person, but that was his public persona. You described him, Ray, when we talked, as being brooding and gruff. And that's how he came across. So I don't think it would come as any surprise that he would have somewhat of a strained dynamic with a head coach, but it got really bad. And they hid that pretty well. They didn't hide it from their teammates very well, but they hid that from the public very, very well up until the time that both ultimately left the Vancouver Canucks. So that's one that sticks out. But even going back, and you hear some of those stories before the West Coast Express got going. Tom Larscheid, the former color commentator for the Canucks, tells a story in one of the early episodes about Pat Quinn getting fired and him being in his hotel room. And I won't steal Tommy's thunder here, but the emotional way he describes that with Gino Ojic and Pavel Bure entering that room while he was doing the interview, that level of emotion, those kinds of stories that come out during a telling of a long tale like this. And the other thing, I guess, that jumps out to me, it's amazing to me how small the hockey world is. Like every time I would go down, all right, this guy comes into the organization. Wait a second. He got traded for who? And that connects back to the Canucks in a former lifetime. How? Like the number of times George McPhee pops up in the story, or the way that Dan Cloutier and Felix Potvin and Kevin Weeks were all related to each other in the goaltending carousel in Vancouver. It's almost mind-blowing how it happens, quite frankly.
How's Todd Bertuzzi doing now? Do we know, Scott? Like I used to cross paths with him on the minor hockey run. His son Tag played against my son Mason many, many times. So in that environment, aside from when the game was going on, because he was an intense father, but I mean, he was a fun guy to talk to, and we'd talk about stuff going on around the NHL and all of that. But how's he faring now?
I think he's doing really well, quite frankly, Darren. I've talked to him on a number of occasions over the last couple of months as the podcast has been coming out, and constantly keeping in communication with him and the other two principals on that line. And I think what people will hear in this podcast, if they've listened already or they haven't even dove in yet, he has a level of accountability and vulnerability that wasn't there during his playing days. He was like a lot of athletes, and you guys understand this. He was proud, and he didn't want to let his guard down very often.
Right.
But Todd Bertuzzi has done a lot of personal work, and it shows up. I honestly believe that he is the star or one of the stars of this entire series simply because of that.
So we'll talk about Bert first, and honestly, he was a unicorn player. Like we talk about what we think a power forward is, and I can go back into my days of Keith Tkachuk and Bert, and like those guys would go straight over top of you or go around you or whatever they needed to do, and they were bigger and stronger than everybody else. It was remarkable and I was envious of watching them play because I sure as hell couldn't do that. So when you get to Bertuzzi, no matter what he did, it always comes back to that March 8th game.
Right.
That was the game against Colorado, the whirlwind of stuff that was going on prior to the incident with Steve Moore. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Ray, you were at the game.
Yeah.
I was at the game. And if you were there, you'll never forget the feeling you had in that arena. And I can only imagine what it was like for any of the people involved in that event to live through it. Todd Bertuzzi, Steve Moore, some of the people who were on the ice, some of the people who were close to those players. And it's not something Todd wants to talk about in great detail, which I think all of us can completely understand.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
But his line mates, his teammates, his general manager, his head coach, they did come forth with how they felt about what happened that night, how they felt then. And Mark Crawford has a quote where he says, I still don't feel comfortable talking about it to this day. Like, it just doesn't make him feel okay. There's really nothing that's completely been resolved in him. And I think anybody who's around that event knows that. And one of the things that I was able to do with this podcast and some of the stories that people shared, I actually had a buddy say to me literally today, how did that incident get so big? He wasn't living in Vancouver at the time. And he said, like, I know that it's brutality on the ice, but we've seen that before in sports. We've seen that before in the NHL. Why did it get so big? And one of the things that you find out by listening to that episode is how it just exploded from a media standpoint. And the timing was like something we've never seen before because it was the day before the trade deadline. You had two networks, and Darren, you would have been working that day. Ray, you would have been working that day. You have, I don't know how many hours between the two stations, 20, 25 continuous live hours of talking about hockey. And as you guys know, on trade deadline day, not a lot of trades develop, certainly early. So what are you going to talk about? Oof. And then as Mark Crawford says in news, it wasn't a particularly fast day. There wasn't a lot else going on. So it got picked up in places that probably it would never have gotten picked up. And
but there's another part to this, Scotty, is that it also had a 2-week run up because Moore hit Markus Naslund a few weeks prior in Colorado. Most people that wouldn't be from Vancouver or Denver forget that the two teams played in between the two games. And then they got to Vancouver. The game was for first place, and it was 5-0 in the first period. There was something in that building that night, Scotty. And, you mentioned you were there, but couldn't you just feel it? Like something when it was 5-0, this is not good. This is not good.
No question. And the game you mentioned in between, which was 5 days before the one that ultimately transpired on March 8th, that was a 5-5 hockey game that showcased all of the talent those two teams had. That loaded Avalanche roster with Sakic and Forsberg, and that was Paul Kariya, Teemu Selanne year as well in Colorado. And, of course, the West Coast Express and the Sedins and Jovanovski, they were all firing, guns a-blazing that night in Colorado. But this was the first game back in Vancouver, and there was anticipation because it was the first time Steve Moore was in town. There was anticipation because Trevor Linden was set to become the Canucks' all-time leading scorer, possibly as soon as that night. And as you mentioned, it was for first place. Nobody thought it could have gone that way because the stakes were so high from a team standpoint.
So just stepping away from that so we don't talk just about that because this is about the West Coast Express. It's not, although it's inevitable that people are going to focus in on that episode, right? Like it's going to happen. Yet when you talk about the acquisition of the players, Markus Naslund was a first-round pick in Pittsburgh. that walked into a loaded Penguins team and he had nowhere to play. And he just became an afterthought there.
Yeah.
How did that happen? And Brendan Morrison, he was the most popular man on the University of Michigan campus ahead of Tom Brady, who was some schlub third string quarterback. And Mo comes here and, he was in New Jersey first. I think a second round pick. Was he, Scotty?
He was a second round pick. Yep. 39th overall.
And so Bert was a first round pick with the Islanders. They kind of get slopped together, but they weren't even really aligned.
No.
Like, talk about how that lightning struck.
Well, Naslund comes to Vancouver and it didn't go well off the hop. He was okay and started to get a little bit of playing time here and there with Mark Messier. But then the upheaval, as I mentioned, occurred when Pat Quinn got dismissed and Mike Keenan came in. And as Naslund details, he wasn't exactly a fan favorite of Mike Keenan's when he arrived. No. Markus Naslund doesn't strike you as a Mike Keenan style of guy. But through injury, Naslund ended up getting a chance. And you mentioned some of the things that come out. One of the things I love that Markus Naslund says is that one of the things that settled him down, they had their first child in 1998. And for the first time in his life, it wasn't just about hockey. When he left the rink and he went home, his mind was focused on his child and on his family. And he was a guy who got inside his head a lot, and it helped him. Well, he started to take off a little bit that year. Bertuzzi hadn't really taken off, but when he got to Vancouver, it was a fresh start. He's playing with Messier and McGillney off the hop. That's a pretty sweet place to land, but breaks his leg and then hurts his knee and misses the bulk of an entire season. So these guys were coming along at different times. Naslund was the first guy to establish himself as a star. Bertuzzi's starting to knock on the door at 25 goals, which is good, but not star status in the NHL. Morrison comes along, and he's not even their center. Morrison is playing second, third line duty because Andrew Castles is between the two, and that line was really good. Well, one night, Mark Crawford decides to put them together in Detroit. Needed a little bit of a change up, and all of a sudden, they have a big game. He can see the speed that Morrison brings to the line because Castles, as good as he was and as nice vision as he had, he wasn't fast. And now Morrison could cover the defensive end and unlock their game off the rush, which had kind of been missing. They were more of a half-court offense, if you will, with Andrew Castles between them. And that line played so well that the notorious line blender, Mark Crawford, he couldn't switch him after that. He had to keep them together because they said the hottest line in the league. And the rest, as they say, on a positive front, is history.
All right, as we wrap up here, Scott, take us into the response, right, to West Coast Express. What's the listener response, and then where can we find you?
Well, the listener response has been fantastic. Thanks for asking, Dregs. And before I even get to that, I want to thank both of you guys because you've both been very supportive of this podcast in its making in a bunch of different ways. So thank you to both of you. But the listener response has been fantastic. Like you guys mentioned, they've really appreciated the details, hearing stories they didn't know about. Some have said, it transported me back to a time where I really became passionate about the game. One of the best compliments that I've gotten from multiple people is them say, my dad's listening and I'm listening. And in some cases, my kids are listening and we're all talking about it. And we remember it in different ways, but we're having conversations about it. And that's so cool because that's really what sports history is. I think we've all had those relationships in our family before where sports moments or eras connect us with each other, with our families and our friends. So that's been great to see as well. The response has been fantastic, which has really been nice on this end of it.
I would say it's a Vancouver Canucks story, but it's a story outside of some of the details. It's changed from team to team, but every team that you follow has some era, mostly when you were younger, that connects you to it, that you never forget. Like people ask, whenever I talk about baseball, how did you become a Boston Red Sox fan? Well, when I was 11, Jim Rice and Fred Lynn were rookies. I don't know why. I thought they were really cool guys. And I just followed the Red Sox since 1975 because something connected me at that time. And for a lot of people, Scotty, this walk through the West Coast Express gets to refan a lot of people's interest. And it's not just Vancouver. It's a really cool thing. You put, I don't even know how many hours into this thing. The product is awesome. It's a great listen, and I hope people check it out.
Thanks, Ray. And thanks, Darren. This has been awesome, guys. I really appreciate your support on it. It's been a lot of fun to put together.
Thanks, Scott.